Interesting. Well, it doesn't even pick that up. That's interesting. Let's get this volume up. There we go. That's better. See what happens. You can do it again. What kind of a day is it going to be today? Is it going to be a bring people up and argue with people day, or is it going to be me pontificating kind of day? You never know. You never know. That's us. No new wars, no new spending, no new taxes. We'd like to cut some taxes, but God knows. There's no such thing as a tax cut without a spending cut. So you got to cut spending first. And we're running $2 trillion deficits. So you got to cut somewhere in the vicinity of $2 trillion a year before you can even start looking at tax cuts. Is that a libertarian position or is it not? I don't know. It's a tough one. Tell me what you think. I want to reuse these lives for YouTube and Spotify, but I got to stop using copyright music to do that, I guess. And see, for me, I think that's stupid. I think I should just be able to use this. Like, I believe in copyright and intellectual property, but what is the damage now at this point? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Oh, Growler House is closing on June 11th. Well, that's over. I like it when this stuff shows up in my feed like way after it should have happened. Sad stuff there. Wow, look at that. All right, what do we got going on here? Not a lot of commentary yet. We got some joiners. Great tune. This very Russian-looking name? I don't know. Obviously, I'm not going to try and pronounce it. All right. I don't know what today's going to look like. Anti-communist, yeah, Russian anti-communist soldier. Outstanding. Outstanding. Sorry for your loss. Don't know when it was, but sorry for your loss. Thanks for the commentary on the song. I try and do some decent background music to get things going here. I follow some other accounts that do like metal, Tumblr. I'm not a big fan. So I try and do stuff that's a little bit mellow that you can have a conversation over. That's what I target. Man, I'm sorry, man. Chechnya in the 90s. Oof. That's rough. So yesterday I lost content. Visibility for my live cannot be restored. Reason: low quality content such as black, blank, or blurry screens. I don't know. This is what I was doing yesterday. It's what I'm going to do today. It's kind of what I do every day. So we'll see what happens. It's the dark side. I'm going to get up and turn another light on. Actually, I'll just partially open my blinds. That should solve a lot of the problem right there. That's a little brighter. I'm not the focus. Not that you guys don't love looking at my beautiful face. All right, kids. So I am working on something within the party right now, which is to unify libertarian candidates across the country behind a couple of races. Casey Whitener's race here in South Carolina and Jeremy Todd's race in what was Thomas Massey's district in Kentucky. And the reason I'm focusing on these two races is because of the amount of money that got spent and the national hook of these two races, where you have $35 million coming in during a midterm primary in a House congressional district to oust one of the most popular, consistently, constitutionally principled, fiscally conservative Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives, and $27 million getting spent to keep one of the least popular senators in the country in power in Lindsey Graham. For a Republican incumbent in a deep red state to have to spend $27 million to hold on to his seat just tells you how unpopular this person is. $35 million to buy a House seat in Kentucky. And we're going to make a decision whether or not that works. We're going to make a decision. People say voting doesn't matter. Voting matters. The money is the proof. You're not spending $62 million to influence your vote or choose the representatives who are going to be on your ballot because the vote doesn't matter. The vote absolutely matters. And these are important things that we all need to understand. They are doing it's a three-front kind of battle against the voter. The powers that be against the voter. Okay, the status quo against the voter. Okay, first stage is the redistricting. We're going to choose who is allowed to vote for us. Now, look, if you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're very sided, you're very biased in this issue. The Republicans are right. If you're a Republican, the Democrats are right. If you're a Democrat, and that's fine. But no matter which side of this you're on, it is the powers that be. It is the people in power choosing who can vote for them. That's what it is on both sides. Right now, the Republicans are doing it more than the Democrats, whatever. I don't know what the arguments, but that's what redistricting looks like. And the idea that one side is going to redistrict fairly and the other side is going to cheat and try and tilt the table in their favor. No, they are both trying to tilt the table in their favor. That's what they do. That's why they do this. And that's why gerrymandering exists, to choose your voter. The other part of this, phase two, is, of course, the SAVE Act. And I know a lot of Republicans, a lot of people on the political right support the SAVE Act, including Rand Paul, including, I think, Thomas Massie. These people support the SAVE Act. I don't. I think it's an expansion of federal power into voting laws. I think it's an overreach of federal power because the states are supposed to run their elections. Second is, I don't like the expansion of federal power in the absence of visible evidence that there's an issue. I keep hearing about voter fraud. I keep hearing that we're importing illegal immigrants so they can vote in our elections and blah, 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 blah. Well, at the same time, I saw after 4 years of Joe Biden and the accusation that borders are wide open, 20 million voters coming in, so on and so forth, all this different stuff. Despite that, the House, the Senate, both went to the Republicans, and Donald Trump won the popular election. I don't see the evidence, and nobody's made a good evidentiary case for me that this is an issue. So absent that, I'm very reticent to allow the government to expand its power and into the national election, into elections, overriding the state's authority to manage these things within their borders. So I'm very reticent to do that in the absence of rock solid, here is smoking gun evidence that there's a problem. And then for me, it's not an expansion of federal power that needs to take place. It is an FBI, it is an investigation that needs to take place into fraud to crack down on that, not an expansion of federal power, and just enforce the laws that we have, I guess, would be my point, and find out who's working behind the scenes to usurp those laws. It's pretty simple. This doesn't need an expansion of federal power. It needs proper enforcement. So I'm very reticent on the SAVE Act. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it and somebody can explain it to me better in the comment section. The third thing is the thing that always happens, and that is big money. And that is big money coming in. But these two races, this thing with, and I could even throw Graham Plantner in there, is big money coming in and buying seats, ginning up in these midterm races, this Lindsey Graham race, and certainly the race with Thomas Massie. In those two races, all this money came in to control those seats, to make sure that essentially in Lindsey Graham, you have a warmonger, a reliable yes vote for any kind of foreign interventionism, any kind of military deployment. You have a absolute yes vote there who has no concern about massive deficits, government spending, constitutionality. He doesn't care about any of those things. He just wants war. And then you have somebody who stood against that, and Thomas Massie, who talked about deficits and spending and constitutionality and stood against military interventionism, and massive amounts of money came in to push him out of that seat to get what is, I'm certain, is an empty suit rubber stamp for Donald Trump. And that means for the next guy, by the way. And so that's the problem. And so those are two of the fronts that we're fighting on. And I'm going to speak on this more tomorrow because I haven't dug into it a lot. I've mentioned Bill H3557 here in South Carolina that's requiring third-party candidates who don't participate in primaries to pay primary filing fees, which is just a way for the two parties to throw an economic roadblock in the way of third-party candidates to make sure that we limit and control what choices you have on the ballot. But it looks like the GOP in Iowa is also doing some crazy stuff in terms of suing to get libertarians off the ballot over technicalities. Again, an effort to control who you get to vote for. So there's a lot of ways in which the established powers, the status quo, is fighting to control these seats. And all this effort and all this power and all this money being exercised is the evidence that right now, in this moment, right now, your vote does in fact still matter. And I believe that these next couple of election cycles, with the advent of AI, with the $39 trillion deficit and how the Federal Reserve is going to attack it, and all the different moving pieces, these next couple of election cycles are going to determine whether or not your vote continues to matter in the future. And I believe that, and I'm throwing my support behind these two races because I believe those two races are the most critical in respect to making sure that your vote still matters and showing these people that, no, you can't just come in and choose who our representatives are going to be. And we will vote outside. And you've got the only way to do that is to vote outside of the two-party system. It's the only way. It's the only way to do it. So let's see. I'm going to jump in here, start answering some questions from the comment section here. Let's see what we got going. Did you see what he did to Matter? I don't know what that means. But why did Democrats open the borders? That was crazy. I don't know. I guess there's one way to view that is if I have a problem with illegal immigration and what the Democrats did do and how that affects the electorate, it is that it increases their representation in the House. It gives certain areas in the country more U.S. House representation. An increase in the census. Since we count all of these people in the census, it gives them seats. So I think that's an issue in terms of the illegal immigration thing. It does shift power to sanctuary cities within these blue states like California, New York, Illinois. It increases the number of census and the number of seats that they have in the U.S. House. But there's no evidence from the vote, just from the outcome of the election, that there was large-scale national fraud being committed in terms of these people being brought to come in and vote Democrat, because for the first time in over 20 years, the Republican president won the popular election. Those two things don't make sense together. And the Republicans won the House and the Senate. So it's hard to justify the idea that there's this massive voter fraud taking place on the Democrat side when you look at the actual election results. So I guess that's my problem there. Let's see. Let's see here. Nice 1,000 pound coins. That's a good one. Let's see. So this is an argument I get a lot. Yeah, let corporations run the government, right? Because that's why, and this is the argument I always make, that's why all this corporate money is backing the libertarians, right? That's why all the big money is backing the libertarian parties. The corporations, that's why we can't count the amount of corporate PAC money backing us fast enough. We want the corporations to run the government, and that's where the money would go, as if the corporations aren't running the government right now. What we want is for the government to have less control over the economy so that corporations can't use governmental power to tilt the tables in their favor, to tilt the field in their favor, and build a regulatory infrastructure that prevents competition. That's what we want. But the idea of like the federal government not controlling the economy as a proxy for big corporations is wanting big corporations to control the economy somehow. It's a weird thing. All right, let's see here. I do get trolled in the comments, and sometimes it gets to me. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does get going. What's your stance on immigration? Somebody asked me about my stance on immigration. Is The immigration system needs to be simplified. It needs to be a faster, easier process to legally immigrate to the United States. But we should certainly be controlling who's coming into the country. Sorry, we should be controlling who's coming into the country. And I also think that to some extent, we should have kind of, if I were to fix this, from my perspective, I think it's very important for immigrants to assimilate into American culture. And it's like, if you're the kind of person who doesn't believe America has a culture or whatever, I'm not interested in having a conversation with you. Watch the FIFA people reacting to what it's like. Watch the World Cup visitors reacting to what it's like to be in the United States in comparison with their countries. America has a very distinct culture. We are different than the rest of the world, and we want to preserve that uniqueness of the United States. So I think it's important to get people to assimilate. I think the funniest thing, and maybe one of the sadder things that happens, is that Republicans seem to be reticent to have immigrants in their communities, when it is, to me, especially when we talk about, and I've brought this up before, South American immigrants who they share that kind of a very similar ancestral heritage of being European settlers from, they speak Portuguese in Brazil. They speak Spanish in Mexico, right? These countries were settled by European colonizers, settlers, explorers, whatever you want to call them. They are, by and large, a deeply religious people with strong family values and a good work ethic. These people are kind of like the natural continuation of that European heritage in the United States. And I don't know, it's kind of a funny thing for me, because I don't think Republicans are inherently a racist group of people like the left wants to point them out to. But I also don't have any other reason than the color of the skin of people in South America as to why Republicans don't want them immigrating into the country. Everything culturally about them is like, yeah, these people share the same heritage and the same background as we do. They would be the most natural people to allow to immigrate into the United States in large numbers. And Eastern Europe is not that anymore. Other than being white, they're just not. Or I'm sorry, Western Europe is not. They're socialists now in Western Europe. They don't believe in free speech. They believe in kind of like Western European socialism, massive government spending, massive taxes. They are in today not our natural heritage. We don't share this natural heritage anymore. I think we share it far more with South American countries than we do with European countries. So anyway, that being short, whatever, a long answer to a short question to make a short story long. I'm in support of large scale kind of immigration, but I think we have to be intelligent about it. And people are going to call me a bigot or whatever. People who immigrate here from like fundamentalist Muslim countries, I think they have a far more difficult time integrating into American society. And that's not to say all Muslim countries. But the fundamental, what I'm talking about. We're talking about the places that make homosexuality illegal, the places that don't let women drive, right? The places where women can be stoned for walking around by themselves. Those places, the people from those places are not going to integrate well into American society. And so I think the number of those people who from those regions, from those particular countries, should be limited. So I think we have to be particular about who we're letting into the country. It's a grand privilege to be in the United States of America, and we should treat it as such. And we should be selective about who's coming into the country. I don't think that's a terrible thing to say. I think the preservation of your society and the preservation of your way of life is why would you not want to do that? Obviously, but I don't think there's a race or an ethnicity that you would go, they can't blend in. But I think there is a fundamental theological belief system and a way of viewing the world that maybe does not lend itself to the American way of life and to classic liberalism and to individual liberty and whatnot. And I think that fundamentalist Islam is one of those things. And so let me take a look at the comment section. I'm sure if we're going to getting immigration is brain drain from other countries mostly. Yeah, and that's common sense in a crazy. He makes a good point. This is one of the issues, right? So when we talk about like open borders, okay, I have a little problem with open borders because, like, I've traveled the world, okay, and I've been to a lot of places. My wife is an immigrant from a country that is developmentally, economically behind the United States, and it's not would be considered part of the advanced industrialized nations. And yeah, the people in those countries with money would be the first ones to leave. They would lose their engineers, and they would lose their doctors, and they would lose their educators, and their college professors, and the things that they need to become industrialized, functional countries. Those things would dry up quickly. So you have to be careful. There is that issue. So there's a lot of things. It's a complicated issue. So, like, this is the problem, I think, with most conversations around this, is that we like to make it overly simple. We like to point to one thing or two things and go, that's the issue. And we don't have really good, intelligent, in-depth conversations about how complicated all of these issues actually are. Economics is incredibly complicated. Immigration policy is incredibly complicated. Foreign policy is incredibly complicated, right? So these issues are incredibly deep. They're incredibly complex. You could study economics your entire life, right? And not know not even understand a tiny fraction of the sum of economic information available, because these issues are incredibly complex. And so to say that we have this solution, that solution, I could point to this one thing and that's why this thing is happening. Like, I point to money printing as a singular cause of the inflation issue and the affordability crisis in this country, but it's not a singular issue. There's a lot of things. There are corporations that create artificial scarcity, so they can maintain pricing power. Right? There's a regulatory environment that prevents competition. There are trade windows or trade barriers that prevent foreign competition from entering the country. There is money printing that dilutes the purchasing power of your dollar. Like, it's incredibly complex why things are expensive, why we have affordability issues in certain sectors, and in certain sectors we don't. Tech isn't one of those things. Like, computers aren't more expensive. TVs aren't more expensive. We know that the less regulated, less controlled, less subsidized things are the things that have stayed cheap. But overall, there's a lot of reasons things get more expensive. And there's a little bit of truth in a lot of different arguments. Yeah, so somebody in my comments just said, yo, debate me and stop yapping. Yeah, that's the way for me to bring that. I'm not one of those guys who's going to bring you up so we can scream at each other and talk over each other. There's plenty of panels where you can go and do that. Enjoy yourself. To be honest, I think we should leave NATO and send all military personnel home from overseas. I agree with that 100%. We should. There should be no sanctions. Here's the crazy thing. We shouldn't be sanctioning anybody. We should have free and open trade with everybody. We should eliminate the corporate tax in the United States and deregulate to the greatest possible extent, so that we are an incredibly desirable place to invest capital and to grow the economy, so that our economy stays powerful. And the value of trading with the United States is what keeps countries from becoming aggressive. If you become aggressive, you don't get to trade with us. If you engage in the world peacefully, then you can trade with us. It's that simple, right? You bring the troops home. That simple thing, not having to maintain this global thing, you could maintain the same military size and strength, right? And still save hundreds of billions of dollars a year just in the cost of maintaining this globally, right? You wouldn't need aircraft. Aircraft carriers are not necessary for national defense. They're necessary for force projection. You know how many guided missile cruisers you could build for the cost of an aircraft carrier? So you make the Navy much cheaper to operate. You expand kind of the defensive posture here within our hemisphere. I think a hemispherical regional power is where the United States should be. You save hundreds of billions of dollars. You let Europe defend itself. You don't have this antagonistic position with your military bases right up against Russia's border, with your military bases surrounding countries like Iran. You're letting these regional powers kind of do things as long as they're kind of abiding by our non-aggression principle. And we don't get to tell people how to live their lives in these countries, how to govern their people. That's not the role of the United States. And I think that you'd have a much more peaceful world. I think you'd have a lot more prosperity here at home and abroad. And I don't think we'd have to use our military to force people to trade with the U.S. dollar, because I think it would go back to being the preferred currency, because we're not weaponizing it, and we're not having. And of course, if you can get your fiscal house in order, we're not printing a ton of it. So I think that solves a lot of problems. Let's see what we got here. Unless you're sanctioned, and let me see. Yeah, that's the thing. What is the benefit if we're freely trading? Why would they want to? If you look at all these conflicts, excuse me, we look at like the major conflicts. World War II, right? We stopped selling oil to Japan. That was an intervention on our part. That was economic intervention in the conflict. We were supporting the Allies in Europe, which I'm not going to have an argument about whether that was right or wrong. I think it was right. As a libertarian, people sometimes will argue against that. Like, this is genuine, pure evil on expansion. But if you look at what happened at the end of World War I, the economic sanctions and the things that we did to Germany kind of led to created the environment for what happened in Germany going into World War II to happen. Like, we created that. So, and we certainly intervened economically with Japan, which is what led to Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. Should we have stopped Japan from their expansionist, and does not selling them oil align with, hey, look, you're aggressing on your neighbors, so we're not going to trade with you? Yeah, World War II is very complex. But in today's world, in today's much more integrated global economy, I think it's much easier to say, look, let's just all play in our own backyards and trade with each other freely, and we're all going to benefit greatly from that. Both the governments who are not under threat of attack and the people who will have more prosperity. I think that's a much easier thing to do now in our integrated global economy. So, like I said, everything's complicated, man. None of it's simple. None of it's a simple thing. Let's see. Let's have a look. Yeah, World War I terms caused World War II, and so libertarian right. I am more libertarian right. I have what I would consider, so somebody's asking me, Jay's asking me in the chat, libertarian right or left. I am a right-leaning libertarian. So I have conservative values. This is what drives me nuts about the left and the right and the infighting within the Libertarian Party. And I don't care about it. First of all, we don't have any influence in politics. So let's start there. What are we fighting over? It's a lot of little fish and an even smaller pond. Understanding that outside of the libertarian circle, they have nobody cares about them. So they're trying to be important within this circle. And that's what's causing the factionalization, I think, within the Libertarian Party. It's like, I'm nobody outside of libertarian circles, so let me try and be somebody within these circles. And that's a problem. The other thing is the left and the right of the Libertarian Party should be in relative agreement, because at the end of the day, we simply don't want the government to enforce our morality on other people, right? So I would say the biggest issue that I would have with the left, quote, left libertarians, and it's not an issue, is probably the trans issue is probably the biggest issue. And I think it's maybe one of the dumbest arguments we're having in the country right now. Keep it out of the schools, keep it away from the kids, go live your life. I think that most libertarians, even left libertarians, would agree with that. If the government's going to be involved in marriage, everybody should be treated equally under the law, but I believe in Christian Judeo values. And so I think that's the best way to live your life, and that's what I'll advocate for. But I don't think the government gets to come in and have the authority to tell people how to live their lives, and therefore I'm a libertarian. The left may think X, Y, and Z, but every single libertarian I meet is like, yeah, but the government shouldn't enforce X, Y, and Z, and so that's why I'm a libertarian. Advocate, not initiate force. It's that simple. And at the end of the day, I don't care about any of these things, because we all agree that printing $2 trillion a year is destroying purchasing power, to stealing our kids' future, and leading to the financial collapse of the U.S. dollar. We all can see it coming. We also understand that the government's getting bigger, more powerful. They are collecting data on us at an unprecedented rate. They are spying on us. We're 2 steps away from secret police, right? And this has been happening for decades. And we've got to speak on that. And those things are far more important than these social issues, which get elevated above everything else. And I think they get elevated above everything else because between the two predominant political parties, there's not a great deal of economic difference between the two of them. And that's why these other things get elevated. Cutting revenue and not expenses is fiscally conservative but not responsible. Cutting revenue and not expenses is not fiscally conservative. It's Republican. Fiscally conservative, from my perspective, is that the government is supposed to do what the Constitution told it to do. So there is no Federal Reserve in the Constitution. We're supposed to coin a common currency that's asset-backed. There's no income tax. And all this money that the government's spending on all these other things are not authorized by the Constitution. So the government has used like the General Welfare Clause and the Interstate Commerce Clause to and lawyers to work its way around the Constitution and grow into this $7 trillion leviathan that is completely unconstitutional. Being fiscally conservative to me means returning the federal government back to its constitutionally defined roles, which would lead to trillions of dollars of reduction in expenses. Would save trillions of dollars. Social Security is not in the Constitution. Medicare is not in the Constitution. SNAP isn't in the federal government shouldn't be a charity. Government has no role to play in charitable giving. These things shouldn't exist. They're unconstitutional. And so that's fiscal conservatism, is that the federal government's only supposed to be doing those things very specifically enumerated in the Constitution that the government is specifically given powers to do. If you want to have a universal health care plan, if you want to have a government-run retirement program, the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, doesn't bar individual states from enacting those kinds of programs. So imagine if you didn't have to send 30% of your income to the federal government and that was staying within your state. Well, then your state would have the financial means to do a lot of different things. The problem isn't that these things are being done, although I would oppose them because I still don't think it's a good idea even at the state level. But I wouldn't say California can't do it or, Wisconsin can't do it if they want to. Let them do it. But they can't take my money, take it from the federal government, then dilute my purchasing power with printing to operate federal programs that shouldn't exist. If you keep all that money locally, all that money within your state, instead of having to send it off to the federal government to run all these unconstitutional programs, your state would have far more flexibility in taking care of the people within its borders. And then we could have 50 little experiments about what's the best way to what role government should and shouldn't play and what works here and what works there. And then that's how it's supposed to function. Yeah, so removing power from the federal government. The idea of, and one of the things they don't teach a lot in schools now is the Articles of Confederation and that history of how fearful the founding fathers were of an overly powerful central government. So what they initially created was a central government that was so weak it could barely function. We would be Europe right now if it hadn't been for the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention that actually formed what we view as the modern version of our government. We didn't have those powers, but for the federal government couldn't even print a common currency or raise a military under the Articles of Confederation after the Revolutionary War. And there are Americans, a lot of Americans, who don't understand that we didn't have a constitution until 1789 or something like 1788. And George Washington was our first president, but it wasn't at the end of the Revolutionary War. It was after the Constitutional Convention when we realized the Articles of Confederation did not give enough central control to maintain the unity of to maintain the Union. And we have all this BS and misinterpretation of the U.S. Constitution as granting all these different powers to the federal government. And one of the conversations I had with somebody the other day was that we've got the how our government's supposed to be structured, and that's in the Constitution. And then we have the why, which is in the Federalist Papers. They gave us the instruction manual, and then they explained the why behind it. And it's all right there. And here's a curious question for the comment section. How many of you had to read the Federalist Papers in junior or senior high school? This is what the Founding Fathers said about our Constitution and why they wrote the things that they wrote. How many people had to be exposed to that in high school and junior high? None of you. I would imagine. I didn't. I did. Okay, that's good. Somebody did. Midwest Progressive. do I want to bring a progressive up here? I'm about a half hour in. That's usually when I start running out of gas and start letting people come up. Should I bring up Midwest Progressive, guys? Does anybody in the comment section know him? Is he going to come up here and yell and scream? All right, let's bring him up, see what happens. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Here's Midwest Progressive. Where are you from, Midwest Progressive?
Hey, Brian, I'm from Wisconsin.
Scotty. Me too. Where at?
The southeastern part of the state. I'm basicly Illinois.
You're a just across the border fib, is what you're saying.
Yes.
All right. I'm from Eau Claire, so up close to the Twin Cities.
Okay.
So, what do you got?
So I wanted to ask. You were talking earlier before you got to Federalist Papers, which is part of what I wanted the understanding for. Do you think that our 50 states should operate kind of independently upon themselves more so than they do?
Way more so than they do. Way more.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So you were saying there at the end that have you read the Federalist Papers?
Yes. But I'm going to be honest with you. It's been a while, and my actual understanding of them as I read through them, I probably needed to read them multiple times and do a better job of like annotating them. I read them so I could say I read them, which is not really reading them as in depth as I probably should. So just to be honest,
I'm right there with you. I'm a big Hamilton the musical fan. So when that came out, I did the thing where I read the Federalist Papers, but I didn't read them for actual content. It was I did the thing. However, I've gone back and I've started. I read them on my own. There's a podcast I listen to that actually breaks down each one. And the Federalist Papers would, specifically Hamilton, would really say that your 50 states acting on their own, not unified, is the worst thing that we could have happen.
Yeah, and Hamilton was more of a collectivist, and Jefferson was more of an anti-federalist, right? So those were kind of like the two opposing stars or sides of this thing. Hamilton was more of a central control authority. And look, even Hamilton would look at our government today and go, "This is insane," right?
All of them would. All the founding fathers.
Right? There's not a single founding father would go, "Oh yeah, this is completely acceptable." You know what I mean? I would take Hamilton's vision of what the United States is supposed to be over what we have now, and it wouldn't be close. I'd be very happy with a Hamiltonian view of the United States being enacted at the federal level.
Sure, but I would like to point out, because there's a specific one. I want to say that it's Federalist like 10 or 11. Don't quote me on that. I'm by no means an expert on it. But Hamilton discusses what would happen if there wasn't a strong federal government over the 13 colonies at that time. And what would happen is, instead of working together, instead of, for the good of the nation, Virginia is going to do what's best for them. And they're going to make trade deals with other countries outside of the federal government. They're going to set up different things than what Georgia wasn't one of the 13 colonies. No, Georgia was 13 colony. So Georgia's going to make a deal with a different country, and we're going to have all of our, 50 states at that point then fighting with each other. And instead of having a political divide where we have two parties and two big factions, you're going to have 50 plus of, okay, well, now Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico are going to form an alliance, and it's going to turn into a giant game of Risk that, when we all played it in our basement back in the day.
And I think that's what led to the constitutional, that vision is what led to the Constitutional Convention. It's what led to the Constitution replacing the Articles of Confederation. It's what gave the central government the power to coin a common currency, to raise a military, to do the things for the enumerated powers of the Constitution are what created a central government that was strong enough to keep the Union together and to have us function in a unified way. The federal government makes international treaties and controls immigration policy, and there's just things that the federal government's allowed to do that form us that keep us functioning as a union. My issue isn't with the Constitution, with the enumerated powers of the Constitution, or even Hamilton's vision of the federal government. My issue is that we've taken the Constitution, we've taken the General Welfare Clause, we've taken the Interstate Commerce Clause, and we've used lawyers, politicians have used lawyers to pick apart the Constitution and create a constant expansion of federal power in a way that none of the founding fathers would have ever envisioned, and I think to great detriment to the American people and our own prosperity. Turning over the power to coin the currency to a banking cartel like the Federal Reserve, creating the 16th Amendment where we can pass an unapportioned tax. I mean, the idea that we would have an unapportioned tax where we would chop people up into different little economic segments, and then the government could pick and choose who gets to win and lose, and we're going to tax this group more than that group. There's nothing, to me, that's one of the most divisive things happening in this country right now. The idea that we took the 17th Amendment and we took how the founding fathers looked at our federal government and said, this is how it's supposed to function. You have a U.S. House of Representatives that is a direct representation to the U.S., to the American people. We have a Senate that represents the individual states and protects states' rights. And then we have an executive branch that has these very limited powers. And what we've done is we've turned the Senate into a direct we've doubled up on the U.S. House of Representatives. We've ended individual state representation. And as a result of that, we've essentially creating an imperial presidency that never should have existed. And so we've warped that so much, and we're concentrating power so much that, like, I don't even know how I honestly, as a libertarian, I don't know how we back out of this. I'm speaking against the size, the scope, the power that our government has right now, and I'm going to continue to do that. But I don't even know how you back out of this at this point. And I think that most Democrats, most people on the left, most progressives would agree with a lot of the things in terms of what's broken within the system. I think that they view the solutions differently than like a conservative-minded person would. But I think that we can all look at the government and go, well, this is a wholly corrupted, bought and paid for system of financial oppression. I mean, it's kind of nuts what's going on in the country right now.
Sure. And I don't know that there's anybody, if you polled them, is really excited about how the government's going. But I think as progressives, I feel like we do have answers. You're saying that, you don't like how things are going, but you really don't know how we can back out of this.
Oh, hold on. I have policy solutions. I know. Okay. I have a very clear vision of what we should do to solve these problems. When I say I don't know how, I don't know. I look at what happened in Kentucky to Thomas Massey, right? And whether progressives may not necessarily agree with Thomas Massey a lot, but even progressives go, well, at least he was principled. You know what I mean? And he tried to use the Constitution as his guidestone. So even though I may not agree with some of what he has to say, I could say that I could look at him and go, that's a principled guy. I look at $35 million coming into a House district race, and over 95% of that money coming from outside of Kentucky, a ton of that money coming from PACs, a ton of that money coming from APAC, right? Ousting a guy who's actually nationally and within his district, he won his district by a larger margin than Trump won his district. So a guy that popular, have all that money come in a midterm primary House race, was buying that Senate, was buying that seat.
Sure, I don't disagree with you.
Okay, and that's a freaking problem.
So how would you solve that problem?
I would say, well, when it comes to money in politics, I don't believe in Citizens United. And I don't believe that corporations corporations don't have a right to free speech, because only individual people have rights. A corporation is just a stack of papers. It's just an entity. Ron Paul used to,
for that one too.
Yeah, Ron Paul used to talk about this all the time. Corporations don't have rights. So the idea that a corporation has a right to free speech and can therefore give billions of dollars and contribute however much it wants to buying ad time in support of candidates and to sway public policy is where does an entity of the corporation derive its rights from? We have individual liberty. We have individual rights, right?
Sure.
And so, and I go, look, we already exercise that control over corporate speech. Cigarette companies are barred from advertising their product on television. So if corporations have free speech. Why can't cigarette companies place ads? That's free speech, right? So
Sure.
we already exercise control over corporate speech because corporations don't actually have the right to free speech. So that's the first thing you would do is you'd say entities can't donate to political campaigns because they're not individuals. Only individuals can contribute to political campaigns. That's
Okay.
a pretty
So far, I'm on board.
That's a pretty easy fix. And then you just set a limit. So Elon Musk can't come in and donate $100 million to a political campaign. There's individual limits. That solves to me, that just solves a ton of problems.
Okay.
The second thing I would say is,
how do you feel about publicly funded elections?
I think if you do these other things, you don't have to do publicly funded elections. The other thing I would do, hold on, one other thing, because the FCC controls the airwaves and they're supposed to be used for the public good, right? That's why the FCC exists. Then I would say every election cycle, the top 4, top 5, I would say here's a great rule. However many people are allowed to compete in the 2 primaries. So like you have a presidential primary of Democrats and Republicans, right? And what do you end up with? Like 16 candidates on the primary debate stage?
Sure.
Right? Something like some insane number like that. It's crazy. You take the average between the Republicans and the Democrats, the average number of candidates who are, and that number, let's say divided by 2, is how many political parties are allowed to participate in the presidential debate. You can't bar libertarians and Green Party and socialists and all these other and constitutionalists. You can't bar them from participating in the process. The public airwaves are for the public good. And therefore, what's in the best interest of the public is presenting as many alternative ideas and creating as much representation as possible. And from the political perspective, then a lot of people should be able to participate. Now, there should be a broad array of views being presented to the American people. You do that, and you start breaking up the 2-party cartel. And then you start solving a lot of problems. And then and so I think that's without expanding federal. So like I oppose the SAVE Act. I think it's an expansion of federal power into what the states get to regulate their election process. So I think it's an expansion of federal power that's unnecessary and unconstitutional. So I oppose the SAVE Act. So from that perspective, I think we could solve a lot of the problems. And then the next thing would be you would have to start reducing the size and scope of the government's regulatory powers to allow the economy to function more freely. And then while deregulation is happening, you would also have to pierce what I view as the corporate liability veil. It's like we give business executives, corporate executives, and CEOs essentially the same kind of qualified immunity that we give to police officers. It's like I've made the decision, me and these 3 other guys made a decision to pollute this river, but it's illegal to hold us personally liable for this because we're behind this corporate shield.
Sure.
And that shouldn't be allowed to happen. If a bunch of executives, if you look at the PG&E thing, right? Aaron Brockovich is my favorite example of like the PG&E thing. There are people who are responsible for making that decision, and they're not held personally liable. You can deregulate the economy and improve corporate behavior by eliminating that liability shield and saying, look, we don't have a bunch of regulations to protect you from competition, but if you behave badly, if you behave poorly, I can bring you, Mr. Corporate Executive, you CEO, and I can hold you directly liable. We don't get to sue the corporation and then this executive retires with a golden parachute. That's not how that should work. If you make a decision that harms people, just because you happen to be part of a corporate entity shouldn't protect you from the liability from your own actions. That's not something I get. That's not something regular citizens get. So there's a lot of solutions.
And I would agree with you with the not letting executives from companies, have similar to what qualified immunity is. Although there's some distinction there. I don't want to go down that road. But if you deregulate, the safety, the environmental, and all of those things, what are you holding them liable for when they're allowed to do those worst things? I mean, where do you draw the limit on what you're regulating?
Well, and I think that's why we have a court system, right? And that's why we have interstate courts. That's why we have a federal court system, to say
Sure,
that.
but a court's only able to interpret the laws that are out there. The legislature branch
So
would have to write laws and create those regulations.
So it's not a regulation, dude. That's what I mean. So we look at regulations as the only protection we have, right? If somebody is drunk and driving on the road, they're breaking the law, correct?
Sure.
So they're in violation of a, like, what, quote unquote, it's a law, not a regulation, but they're in violation of the regulation, right? But they're also engaged in gross negligence. So if you hit me and you were drinking and you injure me or you kill me, not only do I could sue your insurance company, obviously, but I can hold you personally liable for the action that you took that led to that. Okay.
Sure. But
now apply that standard to a corporate executive or a group of corporate executives who make a conscious decision to pollute water, right? And go, you've polluted this river. We're bringing a lawsuit against you personally, for making this decision. Here's the proof. Here's the memos. Here's the emails that said that led to this decision. You engaged in gross negligence or even criminal activity, and we're going to hold you liable for it.
sure,
And right
but
now,
so,
you can't do that.
right. So, but what I would say with that is, we'll take PG&E as an example. I mean, it's one most people are familiar with. I think that's a good one. So, look at how much effort and work it took, and specifically of not giving up, and as much tenacity as it is luck of finding those files, because of the system they had to use. Where when you have regulations on environmental things, on how things are disposed of and things like that, the government can come in and they can get those records, and there's a much higher probability that those executives that nobody likes and everyone thinks should be held accountable are going to be held accountable.
Sure. So from that perspective, what I would say is that, I think the regulatory, so I don't know, it's hard to say, because like as a libertarian, I'm like, let's just get rid of all the regulations and hold everybody personally liable. And I know that that's a little impractical. One of the biggest regulations, like in the housing market, I used to work in the mortgage industry, and I've worked in the insurance industry for a long time. One of the big requirements on those two industries is records retention.
Yeah.
And so like my personal emails, for example, not in my personal email account, but anything I use for company communication. Like, so if I use my company cell phone, right? My company email, all this stuff. All that is, you can depose all that information. I am legally required, the entity is legally required to hold on to those records. So that if I'm investigating a drunk driving accident, I'm on the adjuster on the claim side. If I'm investigating one of those, everything I do, every work product I create is legally required to be retained for a certain period of time. That regulation kind of solves a lot of those problems, because that can all be deposed. So that solves some of that problem. When we talk about, you probably haven't been in the live super long. When I started this live, I was talking about how complex things are, like how things are super complicated. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times we like to try and get down into the minutia. And so you present a solution, right? And you go, this is what I would do, and I think this would be a good solution. And it's like, okay, well, that's a surface level idea. In order to enact something like that, it would take some trial and error. It would take some sorting things out. It would take some working out the kinks in the system.
Sure.
My overall view, like my top down review look at all this, is that the federal government is this huge, complex leviathan. I mean, the Federal Register's over like 100,000 pages, right? And then each individual state has its own stack of rules and regulations. There's all this redundancy and this inspection and that permit and all this. It's so big and so out of control right now. If I were emperor, if you could make me emperor for 4 years, what I would do is say, look, here's all these regulations that we have, right? And hey, Congress, I call this clown season because we're in midterm season. So you have all these representatives and congressmen putting their names on stupid sounding bills, so they can run back to their districts and campaign on what they're doing. None of these bills have it's a complete waste of time. They spend 70% of their time campaigning. They're not really leading the country, or they've turned over all the responsibility for governing to these these four-letter agencies within the federal government. And your politicians aren't really governing anymore. So what I would do is I would say, look, every single regulation at the federal level it now has a 4-year sunset timeline. And the Congress and the Senate are going to have, if they believe that a law or that a regulation that results in a fine or a suspension of licensure, if the regulation is so important that I can seize upon some of your property or bar you from doing business, if it's that important, then you have to make it a law. And anything that you don't codify into, because that's your freaking job. Your job is to make the rules, not to turn it over to some 4-letter agency or 3-letter agency. Anything that's not codified in law, that's not that's not enforceable by any means. You can't fine or suspend licensure, right? If you don't codify this into law, what right do you have to steal from me, to take money from me, or to tell me I can't engage in business if I'm not in violation of a law that's been codified by my legislature, by my representatives? Because some bureaucrat that we don't know wrote a rule that I'm not even aware of, because these rules change all the time, and now I can't engage in business. I think back to like when we were talking about Doge and Elon Musk, and the left was like, I don't want to be ruled by some unelected bureaucrat. I'm like, you're ruled by nothing but unelected bureaucrats. Those are the people who are making the rules and controlling the economy and making all the decisions about how the economy and everything functions. It's all a bunch of unelected bureaucrats. Your politicians are just figureheads. So I would demand that our legislature go back to performing its duties. And if you do that, then the federal government's automatically doing a lot less things, because then we don't have time to pass 100,000 laws. We're never going to get that done. And that gives the states a certain level of independence on how they're going to operate their economies internally. And our Congress and our Senate would be focused on the things that they would be forced to actually prioritize the things that are important at a national level, instead of turning it over and letting these little agencies and all these little kingdoms within all these little agencies do everything they can to justify their budgets by creating more rules and doing more things.
I'd say you sound more like a libertarian light than a super hardcore libertarian.
So like the Libertarian Party is really weird because we have a lot of like anarcho-capitalists, and you'll even have people call themselves libertarian socialists, which isn't a thing that exists, and minarchists, and we try and chop each other up in all these different little categories. I don't know why Americans love doing that so much. Call me a constitutionalist, if nothing else. I'm not part of the Constitution Party because the Constitution Party wants to use federal power to enforce their moral code. So that's why I can't join the Constitution Party. No. Call me a constitutionalist. I am the most light version of a libertarian that you can probably get, which is I believe that the federal government, as designed in the U.S. Constitution, should exist and should do the things that the founders said it should be allowed to do, and it shouldn't be doing anything else. And I think if you go back to that, then you have a much more prosperous society. I would say post-Civil War, right? Late 1800s, early 1900s, pre-income tax, pre-Federal Reserve, pre-massive federal spending, and all of this other stuff, was one of the most prosperous times in American history. You can't view it through the lens of the 21st century because we had child labor and all that, but you're converting from an agrarian society to an early industrial society. But if you look at what was happening, you had technological advancements that were increasing purchasing power by bringing prices down and increasing productivity. You had stagnant wages. So a guy working at the same job at the same wage year after year saw his lifestyle being increased by technological advancements in the private sector that were working their way through the economy and so that's how it's supposed. And then in 1913 we created the Federal Reserve. And then in the 1930s, 1940s, we all became Keynesians, and we said we have to have constant inflation. We have to whittle away at purchasing power every year, and printing money. And these inflationary policies benefit people who already hold wealth and assets because it makes wealth and assets worth more. And it makes younger people who are trying to get a foothold in the economy suffer because it becomes more difficult to get that initial wealth, to get that first home, to start investing for the first time, right? And so it just makes it harder for people at the bottom of the economic scale, and it benefits the people at the top. We don't have a trillionaire because Elon Musk is hoarding wealth. We have a trillionaire because we have I think it is. We have a total wealth in the country went from $400 billion, I think, in 1968, 69, something like that, to several orders of magnitude higher than that. So like everything's worth more. Your dollar's worth less. $100 trillion in 1968 money is about $100 billion bucks. So we're looking at this from the wrong. Anyway, I'm rambling, but that's the issue. Then that's how I see it. And so call me a minimalist, a constitutionalist, and then let's work through the issues created by a constitutionally limited federal government. Let's work through those issues there, while understanding that we have to keep the government limited to its constitutional powers.
Sure, and I would say that the wealth gap itself is the biggest hindrance on your people trying to get starter homes, people starting out in the economy.
Did you say? I'm sorry. Did you say the wealth gap?
The wealth gap. Yeah.
Okay.
So if we go back to when over $1 million, the tax was 90%, when the corporate tax rate was significantly higher. I'm
gonna stop you before, because I've heard the argument too many times. So I'm gonna stop you from making the argument. I know the argument you're gonna make. The 1940s and 50s is a mirage. It's not real. First of all, almost nobody was paying that tax because of the number of loopholes in the tax code. Almost nobody was actually paying that tax. The other problem is that we're looking at that through remember I said things are very complicated, and you can't point to a single cause. So you had this high tax rate, and you also had a massively prosperous time in the United States, right? We had also, coming out of World War II, had destroyed the manufacturing centers of the entire globe. We were the only place for capital to flow. There was no place else to go. You had to come to the United States. So in the post-World War II destruction of the entire world and all the loss of manpower and everything else that the rest of the world suffered, yes, the United States was in an absolute position to benefit and become incredibly prosperous. We could literally have done just about anything we wanted, and we would have had to try to fail to not have that kind of prosperity.
Sure,
A better view of broad standard of living increases in the absence of government intervention and high taxes is that Industrial Revolution period. That's a much better example of how there was no income tax then. There was no Federal Reserve then. We had a stable currency. And that's really when we created the first iteration of what the middle class could actually be. That's kind of when that started.
Yeah, and I'm not advocating for those tax rates. I'm not saying that this was when it was peak. This is what we should go back to. If you give me a minute, I will land my plane.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So what I think, and you mentioned that there were tax loopholes that everyone followed, and because of that actual tax rate, the effective tax rate you were paying was much lower than that. I like to look at Massachusetts in 2023. They implemented their millionaire tax. Have you ever heard of Boston, Mass's millionaire tax?
Yeah.
It was, I think, 4% on anything over $1 million. With inflation now, it's up to like 1.4 million. When they implemented that tax in 2023, there was roughly 400,000 people that were affected by it. In 2025, there were 600,000. So millionaires didn't move out. What it did was it actually increased the amount of millionaires that they had there. So looking at 4%, for someone at a low tax bracket, 4% increase does sound like a lot. Somebody on a higher end paying 4%, we now have more millionaires in that state because they're able to take that and reinvest it back into the state, making the life better for everybody.
But that's at the state level. That's not at the federal level.
Sure.
Right. So, so good for Massachusetts. But here's the thing. Okay. You know what? I'll let you land the plane here. Or is that kind of where you're at?
No, if we look at how our federal taxes work right now, we have donor states. We have, I hate calling them welfare states, but that's generally what everyone refers to them as, where California is paying more in federal money than they take. And you have, Mississippi that takes money that doesn't pay as much. If we could, put a tax place in place like Massachusetts, it's going to be taxed higher in California, New York, Illinois. The places there are going to be the one. Your red states that are upset about it aren't going to be the ones that are taxed anyways. And we increase our tax revenue, and we could bring it down on middle class people.
So this is the problem. Why do we need to increase revenue? The federal government collected $5 trillion last year and spent $7 trillion. So you have guys like this is the problem. This is why I don't like talking about the revenue side at all, because I'm like, you have to justify to me what Bernie Sanders says. We're going to have a 5% billionaire wealth tax, right? And we're going to raise his back of the napkin math says billionaires aren't going to do anything. They're just going to pay this tax. The whole wealth tax thing is so stupid and unworkable. By the way, it's just the most ridiculous thing. It's one of the most ridiculous economic proposals I've ever. I can't believe it's gaining the kind of momentum that it is. It's just a stupid, unworkable thing. But let's say everything works exactly as Bernie Sanders says, right? We're going to tax billionaire wealth at 5%. His back of the napkin math says we're going to raise $4 trillion, right? That's over the course of 10 years. That's $400 billion a year. And with that $400 billion a year, we're going to give everybody a $12,000 check, and we're going to pay for everybody's child care, and everybody's going to get a free community college education. We're going to do all these things. So we're not setting any of that money aside. We're not using it to attack the deficit, the annual deficits. We're going to tax that money and immediately spend it back into the economy, which is inflationary. First of all, we're just going to put $400 billion of what is essentially locked up stock value into the economy, which is going to be inflationary. That's the first problem. The second problem is if you're talking about $400 billion a year solves all of those problems, well, you spent $7 trillion. That's $7,000 billion that the federal government spent last year. We couldn't scrape $400 billion together out of that budget to solve this problem. And what proof do I have that these increased revenues are going to do any of the things that you say they're going to do? Because you're not doing it now when you're spending $7,000 billion. It doesn't make sense.
I'm an advocate for cutting the federal budget, reducing, programs and military and everything else. We do spend too much. And in a perfect world, something like Doge would be great to come in.
Doge was created by Barack Obama, by the way.
I understand, but the way that it was implemented,
They'll never implement it because the powers don't want the status quo. People who are wealthy because of the way that things work right now don't want to change the way things work right now. That's why they spent $35 million to get Thomas Massie out of his seat. That's why they spent $27 million to protect Lindsey Graham. It all comes back to that, is the protection of the current system.
So, like I said, I want reduction in the federal budget. But if we have programs where we're bringing that money in, we can do things. And in the long term, I know this is kind of the third rail sometimes for libertarians, but it is a money saver in the long run. We use that wealth tax to pay for universal health care. It's not free health care, but it's cheaper for everybody.
It's not cheaper for everybody. That's not true.
It is. Cato Institute's proven it.
Oh my God. Sorry. All right. So what we do is we take a look at what Medicare costs, right?
Yeah.
And then we kind of extrapolate that as a Medicare for all system. And we look at the expenses of Medicare, and we go, if we just replace private insurance with Medicare, everything would be cheaper. That's essentially the economic argument behind universal health care and how it would save us money, right?
Sure, that's one way that people make the argument. The other side is if you look at how it works in other countries.
I don't care about other countries. I'm talking about this is implementation in the United States, and there isn't another country. There isn't another country that has implemented universal health care on the scale we would have to implement it here.
India, China. I mean, there's a ton of them that actually have.
Okay. Here's the problem with
they have a bigger population than we do.
Here's the problem with the Medicare thing. The costs are hidden. The cost of Medicare isn't paid by the federal government. The cost of Medicare is paid by private insurance and private providers. This is what drives me nuts about the Medicare argument. And I could say this as somebody who's worked in the insurance industry for a long time. Okay? Medicare passes the rules. Okay? Private companies have to hire the labor to conform to those regulations. The cost of conforming to Medicare is carried by the private sector, not by the government. It's just like the IRS. The IRS makes the tax rules, okay? But the cost of conforming to those tax rules is borne by the private sector. So the overwhelming majority of the cost of Medicare, of this government program, isn't computed in the cost of running the Medicare program at the federal level. That cost is a private sector expense. It's the reason that you've seen an explosion since the advent of Medicare of administrative personnel in the healthcare marketplace. That's where the real cost of Medicare is. Most insurance company costs, and I'm speaking from actual real world experience in the industry. Most health insurance costs in the private sector are conforming their billing programs and the way that they work to Medicare rules and policies. That's what this massive expense is. But we don't count that against Medicare because the private sector pays that.
Sure, but if we're looking at just Medicare numbers and then you expand that, what you're taking out of that is young, healthy people that wouldn't use the doctor as much, and you're giving people that don't have health care the chance to go to the doctor and get preventative care early on that saves money long term. That Medicare for all, if you expand that model, doesn't take into account for those things. And the numbers I've seen, I think it's like $3,000 to $4,000 the average American would lose because you're not paying your healthcare premiums, you're not paying deductibles, you're getting better care, you're getting preventative care.
Okay, this is the question I have to ask. How are you getting better care? Hold on. There is not a healthcare for all does not put another doctor in a hospital, does not create another bed, does not do anything to increase the amount of healthcare available. The same amount of I snap my fingers right now, government's paying for all healthcare. And now every doctor, every healthcare provider is getting what Medicare says they get. There's not a market for this anymore, right? Mm-hmm. Medicare pays way less than private insurance pays for healthcare. Medicare pays less.
Well, when you look at a single payer model, it actually pays less. It costs less.
It costs less because the private market will say, you're going to have this procedure and this is what it costs. And Medicare says this is the limit on what we will pay for it. And if you accept Medicare, so you're going to take this model and say, we're going to essentially these models save money by price capping. And yeah, that's great, but you're not going to you can't put a price cap on something and also say we're going to increase supply. This is the most basic of basic economic principles. And I'm not saying this to be derogatory. I'm not trying to take a shot at you, but this is something that Thomas Sowell says. It's one of my favorite quotes. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. And the people who believe in universal health care don't view, and there's like no trade-off. It'll all be perfect. Everybody will have access to health care. It'll be high quality. It'll be plentiful. Everything's going to be fine. And if you go to these countries, and I just have, it's funny because, and this is anecdotal, but I have family members who spent a year living in Germany, and the expense of actually operating this, like it's not what you think it is by any. It's first of all, it's not free. People pay there's a 7% tax, so everybody's paying roughly 7% of their income into this system to pay for it. So that's an off the top expense that everybody pays to operate this quote free system.
Sure, and I don't think I've ever said free healthcare in this conversation.
No, you didn't. You said universal, and I appreciate that's a much better way to phrase that. The fact of the matter is okay, what's the economic trade-off of doing it this way? And nobody's been able to answer that question. And I can tell you what it is. We're going to put price caps on. Availability will be lower. And what you're going to do is transfer people who don't have access now because of costs. Those people will just get transferred over to waiting lists. And rich people with money, and this is the problem with all these social programs, every single country that has universal health care has a private option for people with money. And so this is a program. So if the program was that good, there wouldn't need to be a private option. It would just be public health care. This is the superior system. But every single person who has the financial means to have access to private health care, and every single country with universal health care has access to private health care and has access to private insurance.
I swear to you, this is not a pivot, but how do you feel about our public school system?
It's trash.
So you don't think the public school system's working either?
I mean, the statistics bear that out, don't they? In terms of literacy rates, math competency, are we putting out a good product? Are we putting out a good product? If the product is an educated 18-year-old ready to face the world, are we putting out a good product?
I think we are doing the best that we could with that. I think.
Well, the best we can that's not an answer. I mean,
sure.
Are we putting out? The question is, are we putting out a good product? Do you think the average 18-year-old high school graduate in the United States is competitive with high school graduates from around the world, whether it's a G7 nation in Europe, whether it's a Chinese graduate, a Japanese graduate? Do you think our students would be competitive in an open market competition?
Sure. And I have issues with that, but I want to get back to healthcare. I was trying to use that to see if we could
Let me jump in here and answer a
question.
question. Let me get in here and answer a question in the comment section real quick. Megan is saying, why are we calling people products? The product is the education, not the person. Our students graduate, the product is the education that is given to these kids. That's what I mean by that. So is the product, the end product of the education that these kids have, is it a good product compared to what the products created around the world? And is the education, not the person? Just to clarify that for you. All right, sorry, go ahead. I'm greatly enjoying our conversation, by the way.
No, I appreciate it. And it's very rare that you actually get a conversation with somebody that doesn't end with screaming and crashing out and rage quitting alive. So no, I do appreciate that. And honestly, I think we do want the same thing in the end. We want a better, happy, healthier society. I think that we want the same thing there. We're disagreeing on how we get there.
Correct. And I think if more people recognize that, I want everybody to have access to very affordable, very high quality healthcare. I want all of our kids to have access to a very good, high quality education. I want everybody to have access to high quality, affordable food and housing. I want all of those things. I view the market and allowing the market to function as the best way to get there. And you view a larger level of government intervention into the marketplace as a way to equalize economic outcomes and give more people opportunity. Is that a proper interpretation?
So one of the reasons I'm a progressive is, I have a little bit of a libertarian streak in me. I grew up mostly a right-leaning person. 2010, I started drifting left and I just kept going. But there's a creator on here, UA Fish, that made a comment the other day that, he's cis hetero straight white guy. He can walk down the street, no one bothers him. He wants everybody else. The reason he's a progressive is because he wants that for everybody else. And that one hit me pretty solidly. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I'm progressive. I want that freedom for everybody.
Then progressives should stop talking about race and gender and sexual preference. Stop making it an issue.
Inequalities and there's discrimination that happens because of those, so they don't have those same freedoms. So we have to talk about it.
I don't agree with you.
How could you not agree with me?
Well, you're gonna have to get more specific than there are inequities, right?
You don't think
there's a tall? Okay, so if I'm 6 foot, I'm 5'10", I'm 50 years old, I'm 5'10", and I weigh right around 200 pounds, and I have dark skin. Right, I'm not a white guy. Okay, so what's working for me, and what's working against me? I've never viewed my skin color as a roadblock to anything. In fact, I don't know that I've ever been turned down for a job that I've interviewed for, because I'm relatively well spoken.
But does it happen to people?
Everything happens to everybody. Like a fat person might be discriminated against. A short person might be discriminated against. A person who's objectively physically attractive by what we would call universally adopted standards of beauty is going to have better opportunities than people who are not. The problem with the progressive idea and this idea of essentially the elimination of bias is what you're talking about. It's an impossible standard, and it could be applied to every single person. Every single person has biases that are working for them and biases that are working against them, and that is just the nature of humanity. And the ability to get rid of those biases, the best way to minimize those, you can't get rid of them. The best way to minimize those is to stop constantly pointing out every single person's differences all the time and making it the first thing that everybody's supposed to think about. You're telling me that's the problem. The problem is it's the first thing that I'm supposed to think about is a person's race or their sexual preference or their gender or their ethnicity. Those are the most important things. Or at least those are the top level conversational items that progressives have. And there's very little focus on the individual person. And that's a problem.
The problem is that there is legislation that is proposed and is passed in areas that do affect the LGBTQIA community. So you're saying that there isn't any, but there are laws that are being passed.
What is the legislation? Give me specifics.
Sure. So they have removed protections of them as a protected class in several states.
There should, I'll stop you there. I'm libertarian. There should be no protected classes.
Yeah. Sure, there definitely should be. People shouldn't be
And
discriminated against.
we're going to disagree. In the private sector, the government should view everybody the same. Individual businesses don't have to do that.
Okay, so
and that's that is a philosophical gap that you and I will never bridge.
That one. I recognize we're not going to settle that one.
But okay, but give me a specific right.
Sure. You know what? If we want to go, how about Roe v. Wade?
How about Roe v. Wade?
Are you a pro AB that people should have the autonomy to do things what they want with their own body? Or,
yes.
That's a pretty libertarian view.
So from the perspective of Roe versus Wade, my perspective on that is that the federal government is silent on it.
Okay.
So the turning Roe versus Wade turning that decision back over to the states is I think the proper move, because this is not something for the federal government to be involved in. It's not in the Constitution. It was an overreach of federal power. And so in my state, in South Carolina, and I say this in South Carolina as a candidate, I am opposed to restricting a woman's right to make that decision. I'm opposed to that. I'm not opposed to, but I've had progressives get mad at me because of why I believe that. And this is the problem with the progressives. It's not that I'm a legal ally of yours. It's, I have to think about this a very certain kind of way. And if I don't think about it that way, then we can't be allies. And that's a real problem I have with the progressive movement and the left in this country right now, is it's not what I believe, it's what I think. Or not what I support, it's what I think. And there's a little bit of like thought policing that takes place on the left that turns a lot of people off. But I'll give you my theory on just abortion. I believe at the moment of conception, you've created human life, and it's scientific. You're the party of science. The science is not on your side. That's not human life. That's obviously human life. Is it a person? No, it's not a person yet. And people have rights. And so it's not an individualized person that has the right to avail itself to the same legal protections as a fully formed, self-actuating person, right? And because it is completely dependent upon the resources of another person to survive, that person has the right, under kind of like the eviction theory, to say, I am no longer going to submit to this utilization of my resources. That resource being obviously a person's freaking body, for God's sakes. So I don't think it's right to restrict a woman's right to choose. And in the idea that we have two humans, and two separate bodies, okay, the conscientious body that has gained personhoods, though that person's rights have to take precedence over the other ones. I do think, as a society, we need to understand that when you have an abortion, you are ending human life, and it's a decision that should have that level of gravity. So that's the honest conversation we need to have. If you're not honest enough to admit that and to have that kind of adult, heavy gravity situation or conversation, I think that's a problem I have with the pro-life movement of the left. It's just a clump of cells. It's not a person argument. That's historically speaking, that's been an argument used for some pretty horrible things. So that's not a great argument.
I don't hate your take on it. I think we can agree enough that we don't have to have that one. But let's get back to healthcare. I think that's an easier,
because we could sit here and talk for 2 hours about
right. And we're two guys. Neither one of us are ever going to be pregnant.
Correct.
But my opinion on it really doesn't matter.
But here's what we were talking about. Though I think there's a conversation to be held around LGBTQ people. So what is the specific? So I asked you for a specific right, and you went to abortion. So give me a specific right that LGBTQ people do not have that cis straight people have.
Transgender people serving in the military. Day one, Donald Trump signed an EO.
Yeah, I don't think
and the transgender lunacy.
I don't think, forget Trump gender lunacy isn't specific enough to have a conversation around, but I will talk about serving in the military, and I don't think transgender people should serve in the military. And I have no problem with homosexuals in the military whatsoever. There's a difference. This is the problem with grouping transgender people in with gay people, because it's not the same thing. It's just not. It's not a sexual preference. There's a difference. Hold on. Transgenderism requires, for most people.
Well, it's not an ism either.
Okay. Okay. I don't hate this. I hate the semantic. I hate the semantic speech policing. You know the message I'm trying to communicate.
Sure, but let me explain why that it's an issue for me. I have lots of friends, specifically on this app that are transgender people. And by calling it an ism, it dehumanizes who they are and their identity.
Okay. Okay. Is dwarfism a thing? Is that an ism?
So dwarfism is a specific medical thing. However, we have gotten away from that where for a long time.
So this is the problem. We get involved in these, like the semantic parts of these conversations aren't important. It really isn't.
No, they are. A person's identity and how they are treated by other people is incredibly important.
Okay. Here's why transgender people shouldn't be allowed to serve in the military. Because
I do appreciate you saying it that way. I will thank you for that.
So the problem is that being homosexual doesn't require, or there's never going to be a demand for a homosexual for an expensive medical intervention to confirm his homosexuality, his or her homosexuality. It is just, call it born that way, whatever. I don't care. They live that life in the bodies that they have with no medical intervention necessary. Okay. You can't be a type 1 diabetic and join the military because of the medical intervention that's required. You can't be flat footed. You can't sleepwalk and join the military. The military has exclusions for people who can serve based on the fact that they have a condition of some sort that it may require or does require expensive medical intervention down the road, and therefore may make them unfit for duty at some period. I could pre-identify that there's going to be an issue with having this unit ready to deploy because there are people within this unit who have pre-existing conditions that would require medical intervention. And the U.S. military is not a social experiment. It is, in fact, a tool to exercise the last form of diplomacy, which is the implementation of force on other countries. So it's not a place to run these experiments. It's not a place where these things matter. So not everybody has the right to serve in the military. There are several millions of people in this country who do not have the right because of a pre-existing medical thing that prevent them from being able to serve. It's not unique to transgendered people.
So on January 20th, 2025, was our military suffering because there were 13,000 transgender troops?
That's not the issue. There
was already 13,000.
No. The issue is that See, you're moving the goalposts. The argument is that transgender people specifically are being excluded from this right. And it's not unique to transgender people. It is a universal way that the military looks at enrollment, period. And it wasn't applied to transgender people. I think that was a mistake, and I think it was a mistake that was corrected. We weren't asking whether or not at that moment in time, whether the military was suffering. We're saying, is the U.S. military allowed to look at a person and go, you are going to need a major medical intervention in the future. We can identify that, and therefore we're going to disqualify you from service. That's the argument. There is no other argument here. That's the argument.
I would say that the argument was made that there was a culture war that was waged against transgender
Nope.
people.
You could say that. You can say that.
The Republicans
that's
in
fine.
the 2024 election spent $215 million demonizing them.
All of
so
that's
on day
all.
one, when Donald
hold
Trump
on.
says,
all of that is
hold
fine.
On, let me land my plane real quick. So they spend the $250 million on campaign ads for 1% of the community, and then day one, his executive order, he specifically says ending the transgender lunacy. It's a culture war bullshit that is being waged on people when there's not actually an issue.
But you are still not addressing the question. This is the problem. You address the question. Does the United States military have the right to look at an enlistee and say, there's a high probability that you're going to need an expensive medical intervention, which may make you unfit for duty. We can identify that before you enlist, and therefore we're disqualifying you from service. Does the military have the right to do that? The answer to that, that's a yes. That is a yes or no question.
Oh, I'm going to answer it. Give me a little bit of time.
Come on, man. I let you land the plane. Now you have to answer my question. Yes,
I know.
No.
And yes, the military does.
That's
however, no, hold on. Let me give you one quick however. However, I think medical studies should be done, and if there's medical studies that show that it would affect how the military is done, affect the safety or the welfare of that soldier or other soldiers, then we can put it on and have that discussion. But with none of that being done, it's culture war bullshit that's attacking 1% of the.
And that's what you're just talking about preferences and oughts. I'm saying from a legal perspective, is there a very high probability that a trans person is going to need a medical intervention down the road that would make them unfit for duty? Is that realistic? Is it realistic
But
to say, is that a realistic thing?
It's a possibility, but I want to see studies and I want to see empirical
It's not
data that shows
so
me
here,
that.
I can give you, I don't have a study and I don't have empirical data. Okay. So I'm not going to pretend like I served for 9 years in the United States Navy. I've never had a problem with homosexuals serving in the military. I have a problem with women being deployed on forward operating units. And I can give you a very specific example of why I don't agree with that. Women on warships, for example. We are getting ready to deploy. Our ship and two frigate and a guided missile destroyer. We're getting ready to deploy to the Persian Gulf. And I'm not going to name the ship. And the ship had 20% of its crew was female. And I was in the Navy when we integrated women onto, that's how old I am, when we put women on ships, okay? That ship, as the deployment window was approaching, because nobody wants to go on deployment, dude, 6 months at sea sucks. Nobody wants to go on deployment. As the deployment window approached, like 80% of the women on the ship got pregnant. And that ship, that warfighting machine, wasn't capable of deploying because of that. And another ship and a group of men had to replace that crew and go back out to sea and shorten their rotational period because a bunch of women got pregnant so they wouldn't have to go on deployment and took a warfare asset off the playing field. That's just an example, okay? The military isn't the place. I disagree with all the culture war bullshit too, dude. And I have no problem. Look, you're an adult person, go live your life. But there are things that how you are born, right? So I'm trying to say this with the absolute utmost respect of a transgender person, a homosexual person, of all the way in which you are born. Unfortunately, the way in which we are born are going to exclude certain people from certain things, and the military is just one of those things. It's just one of those things. It's not, and you could take the culture war stuff and go, this is garbage, and I hate it. But when I break it all the way down to just the law, I go, there's not really, so I don't believe, so what I'm saying is when I asked you for one example of a right that is being violated, I think I've made a better argument that there isn't a fundamental right to serve in the military. And there are exclusionary things that the military is allowed to do, and you did answer yes. So that's not a right that is being violated. So now you'll have to give me another right that is being violated in the LGBTQ community. We'll move on from
that. And I think someone from the community would be much better suited to do that. Because again, as a cishet white man, it doesn't directly affect me. So I'm not going to have them off the top of my head.
But see, that's the problem. You're making a statement, okay? And this is the problem I have with progressives, because I think that I'm going to use an acronym, and I'm using it as a joke. Everybody don't get super offended. But the awfuls, affluent, white, female, urban liberals, right? People who are offended on the behalf of other people based on their anecdotal experiences and the media that's put in front of them.
Sure. But if we want to go down this route, I don't like to tokenize people, but I do have a 15-year-old queer daughter.
Okay.
So I see it. I don't like to bring up anecdotes. I like empirical data or studies. I like things that we can actually talk about. This is going to sound crazy. I have another account on here where I have a puppet named Anecdoodles. Because
that's pretty solid.
Because MAGA loves to talk only in anecdoodles. So to the point that I have a puppet named Anecdoodles now with this theme song. It's a whole thing. Everybody wants, go find that account, give it a follow. I need to get camera access.
Look at this guy. Look at this guy using my platform to promote his. No, I'm just kidding. Go find it. Put a comment in there with your handle and an ad. Just because I've enjoyed this conversation so much. Take a second and do that.
I appreciate that. But so using that anecdotal of my own, I'm watching her. She's 15, and she came out about 2 years ago. And luckily, very, loving environment that she's in. The school district she's in, it is very unusual for a very red area that they are, as LGBTQIA friendly as they are. But even with that, I'm still watching her get, discriminated against and having things said that shouldn't happen. And is that the government's job? No, but it's a reflection of how society feels about people.
But your daughter is unique. right? And when I say unique, I don't mean her experience, right? I mean that as a percentage of the population, right?
Sure. She's about 10%.
Correct. So guess what kids do? They
No,
find things that are, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where it's like, it's shitty, but it's kind of like what my conversation and here's the problem, right? Is that you haven't been able to illustrate to me that there's a right that a straight person has that a member on the LGBTQ spectrum doesn't have. There's not an illustration of a right. You used one example where this is the problem I have. This is the problem I have with like the progressive, especially the social progressive movement. It's all vibes and feelings, man.
And we love data. We love data. We absolutely.
So I'm asking for data. I'm asking for you to give me. This should be one of the easiest, because one of the big things is, it's discrimination. So this should be one of the easiest things for a progressive to do, is to prove to me actual legal discrimination, and that's all I'm asking for. And
sure, give me 1 second. I got to remember. Oberfell is going to the Supreme Court that would remove same-sex marriage. And now you're going to come back and say, well, that's a states' rights issue. It should be pushed down to the states.
No, it's not a states' rights. It's not a states' rights issue, because there are federal implications for what it means to be married. So if the federal government, I'm going to give you my pushback. Not even pushback. Okay. If there's going to be federal tax advantages to being married, and the federal government is going to intervene in marriage, then the federal government has to view everybody the same. So I would be on the right. And look, the Libertarian Party was the first party that supported gay marriage. We're the first ones who did it by decades. We were decades ahead of everybody else. So when it comes to gay marriage and this is what I mean. Show me where it's at, because the Libertarian Party would stand against that. You won't find a libertarian who agrees with Oberfell. If they are, they're not a real libertarian. I can say that as the one true libertarian. It's one of the most early interventions that the Libertarian Party wanted to make was the equalization of rights, and particular marriage rights between straight people and homosexuals. That was one of the first things we did.
Sure. Now, how about we go back a couple of years to the "Don't Say Gay" bill from Florida? Do you remember the "Don't Say Gay" bill?
First of all, that's a progressive moniker that was put on the bill. Sure. There's in the bill. I don't think the word "gay" existed in the bill.
Sure.
It said that something about teachers not being able to initiate this conversation is essentially what the bill was. It was a pretty simple, clean bill.
So it limited and it allowed parents. My wife is a teacher. We're not in Florida. But it did limit what teachers could talk about, what books could be taught. There were things like that. There were certain things that you couldn't say.
Sure.
And
but again, we're drifting away. I'm asking for you said, give me a minute. Show me what the legal show me the legal discrimination. Oberfell, I'm 100% on your side. That should be shot down. If my libertarian position on marriage is that the government has no role to play in marriage whatsoever. There should be no tax advantages to being married or being single. You're discriminating a person's life choice over another person's life choice. Why do I get to pay a lower tax rate because I happen to have a spouse? That seems silly. That is cultural manipulation and trying to create a financial incentive to make people live a certain kind of way. And I oppose that, just like I oppose putting sin taxes on liquor and cigarettes. Like, that's not what the tax code's for. It's not supposed to be to manipulate human behavior. It's supposed to fund the government. So I would agree 100%, but my overarching argument would be that government shouldn't have anything to do with marriage. It's a religious sacrament. Go to the church. If a church wants to marry two people of the same sex, good for that church. The government has no role to play in that. If the church wants to marry 5 people in a polyamory relationship, then the government has no role to play in that either. My
friend Megan in the chat down here had put in Florida Senate Bill 1580.
Yeah, that's the "Don't Say Gay" bill. Right?
No,
the
that's
quote unquote.
That's a different one. That's the medical conscience law that would allow doctors, nurses, or medical facilities to decline performing procedures that violate their conscience. So religious, moral, whatever. So Florida, I think, has the 6-week ban on ABs. Like, if it's after 6 weeks, you can't. But according to that law, if somebody came in the required time zone, the doctor could say, nope, I'm an extreme, whatever denomination. I don't believe in this. I'm not going to do it.
I don't think. See, this is another problem with progressive argument. You don't have to be an extremist to say I just can't. I, in good conscience, don't feel like it's right to do this thing. And so, what you're really making is the bake the cake argument. Now, that's the bake the cake argument, right?
Sure, I think specifically medical providers don't get the right to say this violates my morals. This is legal. This is what the patient wants. It's my obligation to
slippery slope,
do
though,
this
right?
procedure.
Slippery slope.
I'm really not a big fan of the slippery slope argument. I mean, I think the slippery slope is used to, and the biggest example is the Second Amendment.
All right. Okay. Go ahead with the Second Amendment.
No, the slippery slope is used of if we allow this and we allow this and we allow this, and by the end you're at the bottom of the slippery slope. No,
listen,
there's
50 years ago. Okay, here's an interesting thing though, right? 50 years ago, it wasn't LGBTQIA. It was LGB. It was the LGB community. That's what it was 50 years ago. And the fight was that the government needs to view everybody equally under the law. That was the fight, and that was the movement 50 years ago, right? So this is the slippery slope argument. And I don't want to get into the rights and the wrong. I don't want to argue. I don't want to expand the argument. But today, there's a genuine fight taking place over whether or not we should do medical interventions on minors to prevent them from developing naturally. There is an argument taking place. Don't say that there's not. That is the 50-year slippery slope that we're on.
There is for
it's hard to argue.
I actually think I do have a pretty good argument that they want to do hormone treatments on kids that are transgender.
Correct.
That
is a medical intervention to prevent natural development. Sure. That's what hormone therapy is.
What is that treatment for? What is that preventing?
The natural development. It's preventing puberty.
No, what it's preventing is the unaliving of trans children, because their unalivement rate is so high.
Right.
Dramatic action like that is important. That's a life-saving treatment.
Okay, then
they're completely reversed. It does not harm them long term.
Really? Okay. All right. Hold on. Stop. I said it. Okay. I'm not gonna. This isn't an argument, honestly. And I'm just using it as an example. So you're making the argument, which is fine. You're proving my point. All I'm saying is that now this is a conversation we're having in the country, and this conversation that we're having. Hold on. We're having this conversation based on a movement that started decades ago about the government treating adult people making a decision about their lives and treating them equally under the law. And this is the conversation we're having now. Do you understand what I mean by saying so my question, and I got to go because I got to go pick my son up.
Okay. Let me make one quick libertarian argument for you.
Very quick, because I got to wrap up.
It's a decision between a doctor and a patient and the child that the government shouldn't be involved in.
Okay. I'm going to counterpoint that real quick, and then I'm going to wrap up. My counterpoint to that would be I am a born-again Christian. My parents are born-again Christians. My child is a born-again Christian. And my child gets diagnosed with leukemia. And we believe that Jesus Christ will save him. And the child believes that too. And so the child is refusing medical treatment for this disease based on his faith. Should the government intervene? Is that neglect?
I think it is. But
okay, well, but that's a decision between the doc. It's not. You see, there's not a principled defense for what you're saying. It's I
wasn't giving you an argument that I liked. I was giving you an argument that I think you would like.
Yeah, but it's an ought. It's an ought argument, right? So anyway, here's my take. So first of all, if there were more people like you, Midwest progressive, who could come up here and have what I felt was a pretty genuine and honest conversation. Very respectful. I think we did a nice job taking turns. That's those are kind of what I want my lives to be, is this kind of exchange of ideas. So that's the first thing. Second, I think every single adult, and this is a very libertarian perspective, every single adult should be treated equally under the law. Period.
Yeah.
That's it. If the government wants to intervene into a place like marriage, then it just has to treat every adult person the same. Period. It can't discriminate. I don't think private businesses should be forced to do things. I think it's interesting that you draw a line at the medical profession, and I understand that because of the critical nature of what medicine is. Like, I kind of get why you want to draw a distinction there. The other argument against the libertarian private industry can discriminate thing is the power companies, right? You could have a racist power company that's not going to provide service to minorities within their area. So there's arguments to be made around that stuff. The fact of the matter is, right now, and the point that I try and make here on a pretty regular basis is simply this. And we get into these minutiae and these fun little conversations. But the fact of the matter is, the argument I'm typically making is that the federal government is just too big, too powerful, and too corrupt to be trusted. That we should be a freer society, paying less taxes with less federal intervention into how we function. And if we were freer and more prosperous, we would be less concerned and more capable of pursuing, less concerned with what our neighbor thought, and more capable of going and living the life that we want to live. And that would apply to all people equally. So right now, the fight isn't, we could fight all these fights and we can have all this, all these other off to the side types of arguments. But at the end of the day, a smaller federal government, a freer people, a more prosperous people are going to be able to pursue, for the vast majority of the population, are going to be able to pursue the life they want more easily. And that's kind of the world that I think I am and the majority of libertarians are fighting for. So I appreciate everybody coming up. I didn't really keep up with the comment section. Megan wanted to come up and I didn't bring her, excuse me, I didn't bring her up because she seemed a little hostile in the conversation, in the chat. So I don't like turning into screaming matches and all that stuff. But I enjoy everybody's time. Thank you very much for the follows and all the other stuff that you guys do when you come in here. Midwest, you're going to be welcome back up, virtually anytime you want. I enjoyed the conversation. You guys have a good day, and we'll talk to you all later.